This week on Interpolation, we're going to be blowing the dust off our old MSDN subscription and talking about all things Windows. Welcome back to Interpolation. I'm Leo.
I'm Vivek.
Today we're going to talk about Microsoft Windows and specifically our respective journeys. It came to us at pretty formative times in our careers. We have different levels of professional experience and a lot of personal experience with the platform. And we have a lot of things to say about it. A lot of it will be nostalgia, but we do have some kind of current stuff as well. And I want to say Vivek has much more professional experience on the platform than I do. Most of mine is early career and kind of long, in the rearview mirror. I use Windows in a different capacity now. Why are we even talking about Windows? Well, we talked about Linux. We obviously love Linux, and that's not going to change. But we thought that, hey, here's an operating system that's actually the number 2 most deployed operating system across all devices in the world. It's only behind Android when you look at the aggregate sort of deployment count. So it's got about, I believe as of December 2005 survey, it's got about 30% of the global market for every single device in the world that runs an OS. 30% of those run some form of Microsoft Windows, whether it's server or desktop. Most are actually desktop. On the desktop, it's a 60%. Just to give you an idea, people think, Apple, and Apple is great and has huge market share. That's at a 14% share, and then desktop Linux at a 3% share, much to our dismay, as we talked, a few weeks ago. But you can see the 60%, so way more than half of all desktop computers in the world are running some form of Microsoft Windows. And by the way, not necessarily the latest version. Windows has a lot of staying power, older versions, and that's actually introduced some problems, for developers, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. So it's a very significant platform. We have a lot of experience with it. We have a lot of things to say about it. So, Vivek, please get us started on your journey.
Yeah. So I got started on DOS 4.01, which I might have mentioned before. So that was way before the GUI era, and the only GUI stuff you could get was these OS shells. There was some DOS shell, it used to be called.
Mm-hmm.
You launch program things, there was text mode UI interface. Then you had these things like Norton Disk Edit and all, which had primitive UI interfaces. Not so primitive because they're back in action now. So,
right.
In fact, someone just made a TurboVision clone recently. Like it did all the things that TurboVision used to do, which is basically build text UIs. So my experience with DOS was like a couple of years, and then for a number of years I didn't have a computer. But when I did get back into it, the Windows 3.1 era was past, right? So I didn't get to use Windows 3.1 much. I had seen it around and play around with it a bit, but it was the era of Windows 95, and there was a magazine which actually provided a CD which had a demo version of Windows 95. It was like, I don't know whether it's real OS or it's just kind of a demo, but got to see it on someone's computer. It looked pretty intuitive. The whole start menu thing and all that. Way better way of thinking about things than Windows 3.1 stuff. Where there was no distinction between running apps and apps on the screen. Like you had to it was kind of like unintuitive. So Windows 95 was like a gateway for me, especially into learning GUI programming. Right, I'd read about it, never had a chance to use it, but when you got our hands on a computer with Windows 95, it was like suddenly you can do all these wonderful looking applications, which look like professionally made ones. It was not just text, and it was not just some very arcane stuff, right? So my first application that I built was the basic Windows API stuff. I learned it the hard way, and so the basic dialog box, you figure out how to draw all the UI elements on the screen. It's quite complicated, but then there's a certain there's a few parts to learn. Once you learn them, then it's relatively simple to get what you need on the screen. And obviously, Windows 95 used to be blazingly fast, like compared to things would just come right on the screen, and DOS was just one window away, right? And it was a totally brand new. It was a very fun experience after coming from DOS. DOS always felt like you had a straitjacket on.
Yeah.
You had all this multitasking, you could run. Then Delphi came along, and then Delphi was like amazingly intuitive, almost no code, right? You could pretty much, one of the first GUI applications I wrote, which was like of any significance, was was this bitmap file viewer. All it had to do was search files for bitmaps, search a whole drive for bitmaps, show it in a list, and then you click on it and previews. And you wouldn't believe that if you wrote it in Delphi, you would probably not write more than 2 lines of code.
Right.
Everything would just be linked up. You link the search to the the components were just set up in such a way that you could just connect them behaviorally, and that was that was my gateway into doing Windows development. I picked up the more difficult stuff, the system stuff later, but this GUI stuff was, plus you could do databases and all that. So, I mean, I think a generation of programmers in India and probably in Russia, where it's very popular, was probably inspired and used Delphi a lot in the career. I find a lot of Russians are very experienced in Delphi. So yeah, but then at a point you start hacking, and Windows was eminently hackable. You had all these registry keys. You could do anything with the system. You could do crazy things like you could change the places where program files were stored,
Yes.
and you could do all kinds of hacks. You could do. I even had this batch file who would do multiple desktops for me. You just copy everything on the desktop to another folder, and then you bring it back when you do it. So you could do all kinds of things, because once you know DOS and scripting, and it's linked to the system. A lot of system functions of Windows are exposed to the command line. You could run registry and all that through the command line. So Windows 95 was kind of like a coming of age, where you got the confidence that you could do anything with the computer, pretty
Right.
much. And if there was some software you want to try to recreate, you could do that. So obviously we tried to recreate Paint and all those things. I wrote a task manager on my own.
Yeah.
So,
let me just say, I mean, I that's a great way to put it. What you just said about I think of it as the scope and the breadth of the platform. Once you started digging into it, it was an enormous desktop platform, like desktop operating system. Like it had so much functionality, right?
Yeah.
A lot of it was, Microsoft had remember what was happening in parallel with Microsoft is they had their NT versions that were being positioned for professional use, for servers, for workstations, and this was kind of post the OS2 era where they had collaborated with IBM, and some stuff happened there, but they brought a lot of that stuff forward, and a lot of those methodologies ended up in fact and later they unified, right? The Windows XP was kind of the unified NT5, let's call it Windows 2000, but they brought a lot of the concepts that they had built for like large scale computing and kind of server grade computing into that desktop environment, and there was a lot of complexity there. The one thing that Microsoft always did very well, and I think when you look at the schools of thought about obviously software's completely changed now, right? And people will argue that one day you won't need applications, you just use your LLM and that's it. And that's not. I don't see that as super unlikely. I see it as actually fairly likely for a lot of tasks. But let's just stay kind of where we are now. So you have kind of the two schools of thought at the time. You had the kind of the Unix way, which was like infinitely configurable, but you had to build the configuration to be able to use it, so no matter what it was. So if, for example, you wanted to send email with your SendMail program, you had to learn how to write a SendMail config file and do all this stuff, and there was no default that just worked. Microsoft's approach was basically like infinitely configurable as well, but build that 80%, build that as a default. So you could actually just start using stuff and it would work, and then you realize, well, it doesn't quite work the way I wanted to, or it doesn't work that well, or whatever. And then you click the advanced mode and you had all these things. Like when you look at, for example, Exchange Server, which I did, a long time ago, I think the configuration dialogues had like 50 tabs on them. There was an infinite amount of stuff you could do, but we're talking about an enterprise mail platform that you didn't actually have to configure very much. You could just start using. It was just when you wanted to do more advanced things. And that was Microsoft's philosophy. And that's why we could just turn it on and use it without having to learn all that stuff. But it goes without saying that they brought a lot of functionality into this desktop platform that had never been seen on a personal computer before, because it came from kind of the server world and the enterprise world, right? So continue.
So then, Windows 98 came along. I think IE4 and IE5 were like it was the first time that the browser was really ubiquitous, right? And the internet also came along around
they got in trouble for that because they kind of killed Netscape. But anyway, but
Netscape did a job. I mean, like Internet Explorer was very familiar. It worked, at what it was supposed to. And then they had this whole my favorite part of Windows, which is ActiveX and COM, right?
Right.
Every component system can be used by any program, and consistently.
Hold on, just for the record, it took you 10 minutes to get to comms, so this is usually longer than it takes you. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I still, look back fondly upon those days where I was writing COM objects, and it felt like a very well engineered system. Whoever
Yeah.
built that system in Microsoft
Yes.
was really into, like, he figured out how to actually use OO for what it's meant to be,
Yes.
right? Reusable components, registries, things like that.
Yes.
So that was amazing. And then Windows XP came along, and boy, it was, I would say that it ranks as the best OS of those. You can look back at it as one of the best OS experiences of a career or a thing.
Yeah, and actually, the last time I looked, this was a few years ago. It was still being used significantly, even after multiple newer versions of Windows had come
Right.
out.
I think they terminated long-term support just a few years back.
Right.
Yeah. And, suddenly development was no longer a pain because your debugger wouldn't crash the whole system, and you wouldn't get a blue screen if you're doing system stuff.
Right.
It was just so robust, and I actually spent a lot of time trying to configure Windows XP so that I didn't have to log in as an admin. I couldn't quite achieve that. It's very hard to make a system with a non-admin login on Windows, which doesn't feel too constraining, and I think that's still the case till today, right?
No, I disagree. Oh, anyway.
Yeah, at least for the kind of thing that I was trying to do, probably I was, already messing the system too much, and it felt like even installing an application or something would require permissions and things like that.
Installing an application requires admin permissions.
Yeah.
It's installed in the system area, yes. But that's true on Linux too.
And I think a lot of the bad rap that Windows gets is because everyone was running as admin, and firewalls, and back in the day, cable internet would give you a direct IP, right? You had incoming connections directly from the internet.
Sure.
It was common to have that.
Yeah.
So, all those backdoors and things got exploited, and there was a lot of...
You had a device on the internet being hacked constantly.
Yeah.
And it happened
and
to
then,
be running.
Antivirus were not so quick, and you often turn them off, and someone give a USB drive or something, and that's how I got my both of my virus infections that I ever had. One was from a floppy from a friend, and he said, like, this thing has a virus on it, and we didn't believe him, and he's put it in a DOS box, and then every exe file started growing.
And you even after he told you, you loaded it anyway.
Yeah, we didn't believe him. We didn't know what a virus was quite that much, and we were like, how on earth is it going to affect stuff? And then we realized, okay, it actually changes the exes, and then it keeps on spreading. So the second one was from a USB drive. I plugged it in, and auto ran. So Windows left a lot of open doors or open windows, so to speak, for the ease of use, which I think contributed to its bad rap. The system was badly designed in some areas, but mostly good. I don't have much complaints about Windows except for its instability during that year. Right?
Yeah.
After Windows 7 came, I think that was peak Windows. I don't think there's been another OS that has been so loud from Microsoft or has served so many people reliably and without getting in the way. Right?
Yeah.
And I think you want to say something about Windows 8, which was, I think, probably the long road downhill.
Since we're talking about Windows 8, first of all, I'm a software designer, by trade and by experience. So I look at software differently than a lot of people look at software, right? I say it like this: I am genuinely unimpressed with almost all software that's ever been made, because most of the stuff that we're seeing, and I know there's new areas that I'm not going to get into it too much about what the latest and greatest is, but most of the stuff we've seen is just kind of rehashes of things that we had seen for the last few decades. So when I saw somebody come up with a new way of doing something, it was like, well, all you did was, you reimagined the way that we had been doing this for the last 30 years. So I mean no disrespect to anyone who put a lot of effort into building any sort of frameworks or anything. But for me personally, because I'm a practitioner and I have a lot of experience, I'm not easily impressed, right? And, so I look at software that way. I look at what's really unique about this software. And Windows 8, and I want to talk about Windows 8 in a more holistic way than just the desktop version, because you have to remember, at the time they had a phone version as well. So when Microsoft had a Windows Mobile that had been around before for a while, actually, it was based on, I don't know what shell they based it on. It was it was something, but it was used on very small number of devices. I mean, BlackBerry was so you had kind of, you had, I'm trying to remember at the time, you had the Palm OS that was popular. Apple had just come out with iOS in 2007 or whatever it was. You had Palm OS that before that, was even making it onto phones. I used that quite a bit, both the Palm Pilot as well as the actual phone with the Palm Pilot in it. This was before, these were smartphones, like literally smartphones, before people recognized the smartphone era. They give Apple the credit for that. But with all due respect, the Palm OS was a smartphone as well when you paired it with a phone. And, you had BlackBerry as the predominant enterprise mobile platform. And BlackBerry was dying, right? Research in Motion, like the BlackBerry platform was dying. It had run its course, and they didn't have a follow-up act that anybody really wanted. And there was an opportunity because the iPhone was still very much a personal device at the time. There was an opportunity for Microsoft to come in as an enterprise software company and say, here's the new enterprise, mobile standard. And the big opportunity they had was to make it consistent and compatible with their desktop version, which was Windows 8. And they didn't do that. They actually had a similar look and feel, but they had competing groups within the company, kind of pointing knives at each other who weren't collaborating. And for example, they had a tablet version and the apps weren't compatible between the tablet and the phone. And that was the kiss of death. But what I saw in Windows 8, especially on the mobile, because I actually used it on mobile, the Windows Mobile at the time, was a completely new, different paradigm of how you actually used a mobile device. It was people-based. It wasn't app-based, in the sense that, all the actions revolved around, there's this person who's doing something, they're messaging me, they're doing this or that. But I choose the person first and then I talk to them instead of choosing the app and then talking to them. Yeah. Now, both Android and iOS have kind of gone in that direction to a great extent, but they're both largely app-based platforms. So I thought it was incredibly unique for Microsoft to do this. And it's unfortunate that they blew the opportunity to become a competitive platform in the mobile space because they weren't able to do a coordinated launch across all their devices. It was a huge missed opportunity. So that's the lens I look at it with. I used it very briefly. 8 was unusable. 8.1 on desktop was better, but thankfully 10 came along, and that's we'll talk about that in a bit.
It's interesting that you bring up the tablet thing because I remember that the very first Windows 3.1 version that I saw, that was on another person's computer, was actually called Pen Windows. I don't know what they had installed, but it said Pen Windows. It seemed to be something that had to do with some sort of tablet device. I have no idea. I never come across that.
No, it was a light pen on the screen. So there was, and in fact, the Windows GDI, the Windows API for graphics had pen events as well. So it wasn't just like a mouse movement; it was like pens, and sensitivity for the pen and all that stuff. So that was what it was. I don't know if it was tablet or you just went up and you had a monitor.
Yeah, probably it was a light pen because in those eras there were no flat screen devices.
So I mean, this was again, that was being used by super high end, design shops and things of that nature. Things that just made it into the desktop version because they were the same code base, right?
Yeah, and then Windows 10, I think I kind of like skipped that whole boat because after Windows 7, I jumped directly into Linux.
Mm-hmm.
The few times that I did use Windows 10, I hadn't used it enough to feel familiar, so it always feels like a bit of a struggle, right? And now I'm forced to use it on a work laptop, but mostly I just use WSL.
Mm-hmm.
And then the greatest thing that Microsoft did was to give a drop-down terminal, quick terminal mode.
Well, I mean, that's the user experience, but WSL is a really, really good platform for Linux in general, right? And for a lot of reasons, and we can get into that.
I think there's even, if you have a system that's well configured for Windows, there's a chance that your Linux WSL works as good or better than the native Linux itself.
100%.
The drivers and other things, especially NVIDIA drivers and hardware acceleration, all this stuff works.
Well, and you don't need the stuff that Linux is not great at, which is the desktop part, because you have the good desktop right there with all your desktop apps.
Even if you do run your GUI apps and stuff, it just works seamlessly. They just made it so easy to have two operating systems running in the same at the same time without even having to switch windows, right?
You can use, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't do this, but you can use VS Code to actually run code in WSL, like using native VS Code on Windows, so you have that seamless integration, right?
Yeah, you can do all those things where you can run your Python stuff inside the Linux thing, and your Windows is running the IDE and things like that. So it's come a long way, and I think while I have a lot of issues with Microsoft, I really appreciate what the Windows team has done in until I think around 2014 or 15, when Intel switched over to the 64-bit architecture for good, right? It was possible to run any Windows application from Windows 1
Right.
on the latest OS. It was possible to find a well-written application from all the way from DOS all the way up to the latest whatever they were using, the XML based UI that they have, Windows Foundation or whatever it's called. All
Yeah.
of those work because they spend such a long time and so much effort trying to make sure that users' previous apps don't break, right?
Yeah. Because of the install base is huge, right?
Yeah,
It's
and
a big deal. Yeah.
if you read, there's this amazing blog called The Old New Thing by Raymond Chen. I think it's one of the most entertaining historical technical blogs that you could ever find. There's a book also called The Old New Thing, and it
Okay.
describes all the decisions that went to Windows, the actual things that happened in Microsoft, the actual things that they patched and worked around to make sure some obscure software doesn't break because they're misusing the feature.
Yeah. I remember the thunking, right? Like the 16-bit. So they had subsystems that were still 16-bit code,
Yeah.
but you were running the Win32 client against it, and they had this thing called a thunk in the DLL that would actually like translate down to be able to make a 16-bit call. Yeah, and they did it seamlessly.
It's crazy. I mean, like I they actually did this thing which is described where you have to upgrade a car from a Ford Model T into a Ferrari
While you're
without
driving.
stopping the car. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
100%. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So yeah, I think the Microsoft hate comes more due to certain the company's actions and certain individuals who are well known for being pretty mean or whatever. But
yeah.
on the whole, I think if you look at some of the best books that I read, technical books, I forget his name, Mark Russinovich, right? Mark
Yes,
Russinovich used to be a guy
yes.
who wrote Windows tools better than the Windows guys did, and so he got hired
The
to build
sys internals, was it this guy?
yeah,
The Yeah,
system Linux.
yeah. Those things were great. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like the first thing you install on the system, right? And then
Yeah, right.
Mark Russinovich became the kernel architect of Windows 7, right? No wonder it
Mhm.
was so good.
Yeah.
So that was amazing. I think Microsoft missed a huge opportunity with Longhorn, as they called it, right? With the database as a file system, they had some interesting ideas out there, but I think they over promised, and so they had to cut it down. Yeah, so it's been a great journey for Microsoft, I think, too. And I finally appreciate to some extent the fact that they stopped fighting Linux at some point. They
Yeah.
realized that the positive sum game makes more sense for everyone.
Yeah. I mean, look, we have to give credit here to Satya Nadella, right? I mean, and it's amazing. I mean, he's been CEO since 2014, so he's been at the helm since 2014, 12 years, and he's Indian American CEO of the most successful software company in history. And ever since Satya Nadella came on board, I think a couple of things happened. You just mentioned one of them. Microsoft became more about interoperability than about seizing control of everything they touched, which was the Ballmer and Gates kind of original days. The second thing that happened is Azure, and not just Azure, but the move to software as a service for what used to be very expensive desktop applications like Microsoft Office.
Yeah.
I think I pay $12 a month now for my 365 subscription, which
Yeah.
is it's coffee money, right? I mean, a couple of
Mhm.
coffees. And it gives me all this power, and I don't have to worry about updating anything or renewing subscriptions or anything like that. And at the time, in those days, there was a huge struggle with companies that were trying to move from kind of licensed applications to software as a service to subscription type apps. The big issue they had was not the technology; it was how do we compensate the sales guys, right? Because
Yeah.
salespeople are compensated on commission based on what licenses they, like in a traditional software selling mode, what licenses they sell. Well, if now somebody moved to subscription, how do we compensate them? And if I'm not mistaken, and I don't have the exact timeline of events, but I don't know if it was before or right after. This might have been what got Satya the job at the top, was that they had this idea that we're just going to pay them the same, regardless of which one they sell, and we want them to sell the 365. Even though they're selling it at a fraction of the price of the actual desktop Office. And of course, the rest is history. I don't think anyone actually buys a box of Microsoft Office anymore. I'm not sure it's even for sale.
Yeah.
but had it that mindset today, it's so obvious. Like, how else would you license software, right? Commercial software. But 10, 15 years ago, not so obvious. And it took even, it took Adobe a lot of effort to do this as well. And, I think Satya, Nadella, and kind of Microsoft's transition at the time deserves a lot of credit for transforming the company into a, let's call it a cloud, a software company for the cloud era, right? And
Yeah.
never mind the amount that they've invested in Azure and all these things. But part of embracing the cloud was, to your point, Vivek, was also saying, hey, Linux is here. It's going to be used extensively. It is used extensively. We're going to interoperate with it. We're going to bring our own value and our own tools. But and we're going to build tools to improve the interoperability. But we're not here to try to kill Linux anymore, right?
Yeah.
And this has been, I think, and to your point, I think a lot of people left the Microsoft platform in anger before this shift actually happened, and then kind of missed that this shift actually happened. But it has happened. And if you stayed on the platform, like for me, I can tell you that, it's a very, very different sort of world now than it was even 50
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah. Ironically, now, it's reached a point where, as of maybe 2025, 2026, Linux has actually become better at gaming than Windows in certain circumstances, thanks to SteamOS.
Right.
I think Microsoft had something to do with it, with Steam. I mean, there was something to do with the Steam, Valve, and Microsoft, which
Right.
led him to try to find an alternative platform. And he spent a lot of money and time and energy finding out how to run games, Windows games on Linux, right?
Mm-hmm.
So recently, I think Microsoft's like, let's take it back. We want to be the premium gaming platform once more. So that's good. I mean, we reached a point where, Linux is able to egg Microsoft on to do what it does best, is games, right? Like, who
Right.
uses desktop for, I mean, probably the most common desktop application is the game, right?
Yeah.
Like, who uses, I
Sure.
haven't seen, even on Linux, right? Most of my work is in the browser, right?
Right.
There's a couple of apps I use on the desktop, but
I think that's true of any desktop. Like
yeah,
for the average person, the majority of what they do is run non-native apps in a browser. The
right,
majority.
right.
And then there's some specialized apps, maybe, but even video editing and stuff like that is moving to browser now. I know companies are invested in trying to do cloud gaming, but I can tell you that like serious gamers, as you said, are still running. I mean, I have a racing simulator right over there. It's running Windows. I think that one's running Windows 10. And yeah, I wouldn't run anything else, right? So
Yeah. And I think Microsoft's moved more towards a lot of research stuff, no? Like
yeah,
they work with the LLM models and all. It's quite interesting. They did the BitNet stuff. They did the Gemma stuff. They're
yeah,
doing a lot of stuff which is open and free. Like they don't have any. It's like pure open source and full
right.
credit to them. But then Windows has always been that that weird character on the street. He's been living there for a very long time. He's got a lot of junk in his house, right? And you've seen him from when he was a kid all the way up to when he's grown up with us. So I think it was Microsoft was what brought Windows was what brought people to computing. Was it not for Windows, right?
That's
It would
true.
be only academics and these very high up people, running very big workstations for industrial applications. I don't.
Or kind of niche, just think back, right? At least in this country, early 80s, you had a lot of 8-bit personal computers at home, Apple IIs, Commodores, things like that, TRS-80s. But yeah, I mean, they were the jump from there to like a graphical desktop environment. You could go Mac, and some people did. They were incredibly expensive. They were very small. The Mac Classic was a very tiny screen. It was black and white. It was all this. But then, kind of how the PC side of things evolved with Windows and all that. It took quite a while before kind of the Mac kind of matched it on the desktop again. And of course, that's kind of become the sexy predominant platform for consumers now and business as well. But for a long time, I think you're right. It personalized. Let's say it democratized the personal computer, because now
Yeah,
when you booted up your system, you were right there in your graphical shell. You could double click and do stuff. You weren't having to type either DOS commands or basic commands. Which, by the way, you were using a Microsoft ROM as well in an Apple product back in the early '80s. So
hmm
Microsoft, I mean, when we talk about Windows, I mean, Microsoft was founded in 1975. And if you used a personal computer in any time between, call it, I don't know, 1979 and probably 1990, early 90s, more than likely you were interacting with Microsoft software in a very, like, to do anything, right? Like to
Yeah.
launch anything.
Yeah.
Whether it was an Apple Basic or DOS on the command line or whatever it was. And what Windows did, it continued that interacting with Microsoft software, but it created kind of a very intuitive launch pad, when, especially Windows 95, as you put it, for being able to run all your applications without having to touch the command line, right? And to
Yeah.
understand these things. So it really opened it up. And then you kind of started seeing things like, at least in this country, you know, America Online, AOL with the dial-up internet and everything, where prior to that, the people doing dial-up were like, they were geeks, they were doing BBS
Yeah.
stuff,
They were
and it was all
neckbeards.
text-based, and it was hackers and whatever. And then all of a sudden, now you have people like going online, chatting with their friends, sharing pictures, you know, like almost overnight. But that was due to having a platform that they could do it from, right?
Yeah. I don't remember ever having to learn Windows. It
Right.
just like it was very obvious how to use it. Like once you knew what a right click does and what a double click does, it was pretty much it, right?
Right.
And yeah, so and also I think a lot of people might not realize is that the CD-ROM revolution, right? Optical media was pushed by Microsoft a lot. They
Mm-hmm.
supported, released CDs and stuff,
Sure.
and without them, we probably would have never had that whole CD.
Because it was cheaper than manufacturing 50 floppy disks to get something installed. I mean, but yeah, for whatever reason. But yeah,
They pushed certain technologies and they did work. I mean, like they've held on to their guns and they became a victim of their own success. Like a lot of the stuff is because it was so widely used. It was targeted for vulnerabilities.
right.
Code base got too big. They had to do this whole upgrade thing. And then one of the amazing things they did was to kind of merge the Windows NT and
Yeah.
the 9X series of OSs.
Yes.
Kind
Yes.
of seamlessly. It was a
In
little
in
annoying.
one generation. In one
Yeah.
generation. So and that was almost immediately available to consumers as well.
Yeah,
And
you had like Windows NT4 with the Windows 95 interface, and then 2000 with the,
yeah,
2000 was kind of almost like a desktop OS right there,
became
and
a
then the rest is history. And
yeah.
yeah, my experience with Microsoft's other tools about Windows, but then no, you can't fail to mention Visual Studio, the Visual C++ tool.
Sure.
I think it set the standard for how a GUI application could
Yep.
be. Extremely complex, extremely robust, very
Yes.
blazingly fast.
Yes.
Yeah, it was amazing. And
that's coming from you, that's a big compliment, because you're
yeah,
a Borland guy. You were a Borland guy more than I. You know, my household was all Microsoft. My dad was
yeah,
always
I used to have this thing where I write the DLLs in C++ in Visual Studio, and then I would write my Delphi GUI and then
to
lift them
call
up.
the deal.
Yeah, I did a lot of stuff which required C and C++, so I did that, and that was amazing because they worked so well together, and it was great.
Well,
And
Vivek, sorry to interrupt you, but talk about, I mean, this wasn't really something that I used professionally. I played with it a little bit. I think we all did, but some people made a career out of this. But Visual Basic.
yeah, Visual Basic, like yeah,
Plus, right? I mean,
it was like a vibe coding tool of the 90s, right?
100%. It was amazing what you could do with almost no code, and the code you did have to write was basic. It was basic.
Yeah.
It was kind of modernized basic. So most people had some exposure to that from days past, right?
Yeah, yeah. It was amazing to see that people who had no experience with computers, pretty much like the 80s, right? Where someone bought some Commodore and they're writing the shopping list or their, budgeting app or taxes. They're doing the taxes.
Using a book about how to write basic programs, and they're just like, 10, do this, 20, go to 10, and that's, and yeah, but they were able to carry that forward into Visual Basic and build like state-of-the-art GUI applications by mostly just clicking and drawing.
Yeah, a whole number of vertical apps for so many small businesses. And there were all sorts of people who were using it, like there were kind of industrial control apps and things like that written in Visual Basic.
Mm-hmm.
It just needed to send signals to other machinery that turn things on, turn things off, control stuff.
Yep.
Control panel. So it was a big democratizer. In fact, the first visual development tool that I saw was Visual Basic.
Right.
I saw someone like he installed Visual Basic of 23 floppies or whatever, and said, "Okay, show me what does it do? Why is it called Visual Basic?" He said, "Okay, here's a form, here's a button, and I double click it and I can show you hello world." That's great. And then next month, in a couple of months, I read about Delphi and like, wow, this is the same thing, but industrial strength. So
right,
it was amazing. I think a lot of stuff Delphi actually they were parallelly developing, but both of these platforms borrowed from each other.
Sure.
Eventually, the creator of Delphi, Anders Helsberg, moved to Microsoft, and the whole .NET thing came out of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think as a GUI platform, they were way ahead of X11 and the way. I mean, sure,
Sure.
Qt and all came along at some point, but before that, the way you would develop GUI apps was pretty much, it was quite arcane. It was not.
Yes.
I tried a bit when in my early Linux days in the 90s. It was very hard to understand how to go about it. It was,
Well, the thing about X is, just to put it in perspective, and I don't want to spend too much time on non-Microsoft, but I'll talk about the difference. X is it's everything's layered, right? You have X11, you have XLib, you have XT, you have Motif, you have all these different things, and they layer on top of each other. And you rarely actually interface with the X11 directly. You use, and now with Qt or Qt and GTK and all these different things, you're even higher up the stack, and you're using some very high level constructs. So if your foray into GUI programming was X11, what you learned, which is very important, was event driven programming, which was kind of the key foundation to that. You have an event loop, and then you listen for events and you do stuff. And by the way, this is how, I mean, anything, it's not just GUIs. Like if you're writing Kubernetes code, this is how it works. You have a watcher, you get your event loop breaks, and then you do some API stuff or whatever in your code, and you go back to the loop and wait for the next event to happen. X did this with X programming with UIs, right, with graphics, but you didn't want to use it at that level because you had no like constructs of any type, like menus or anything like this. You had to actually use a toolkit on top. Microsoft took the approach where their GDI was effectively everything in one, right?
They had the toolkit, and they had their own bundle.
Exactly.
You could have a file selection dialog or whatever, and it would just work.
Exactly. And if I could segue, because I want to talk about a little bit about, because you mentioned Visual C++. So this was so at the time I was, we had a, this was like 1992, I guess, we had a small family software business. And this was my dad basically getting contracts to write software for clients. And he had this one big client they made UPSs. And they competed with American Power Conversion. They weren't as big. Eventually, I think they were acquired by American Power Conversion. But they had a UPS that had a serial interface that you connect to a computer, and you could actually get like power status and things like this. And when you had a file server, for example, you wanted to make sure you shut down the file server properly, whether it was Unix-based or NetWare-based, which I'll talk about in a minute, and so that you didn't corrupt the disk and all that stuff. And you wanted to listen for when the UPS said, hey, I'm almost out of battery. So you had this interface. So they contracted my dad to write software to take that and up to the network, meaning starting with NetWare. So you had this NetWare file server, and you had to kind of send events out to all the clients saying, hey, the server's about to shut down, do X, Y, and Z. And so my dad was writing these things called NLMs, which are NetWare loadable modules, which is kind of like a cross between a daemon and a service and all these different things. And it was using the, if I'm not mistaken, the Watcom C compiler, which is like it was required for this, right? So Novell, and keep in mind, in those days, I mean, people forget that when you talked about an office computer network, like in the 1980s and early 90s, it was probably running NetWare. And because today networks, at any network, is used for collaboration, and collaboration includes sharing and includes a lot of real-time stuff like communication and all this stuff. In those days, it was really just file and print sharing that were the killer apps. So you have to be able to save your files onto a network disk so that other people can access them, or that you could back them up or whatever. And then you also had to be able to print stuff. And you didn't have a printer attached to every computer. They were expensive and it was useless. You didn't print constantly. So you had one printer in the office, and over the network you would print. And anyway, Novell had a file server that was very robust. It did a lot of things, but primarily was for file and print services. And so my dad had written these NLMs, again, on contract. And then the client said, hey, we need a Unix version for like SCO Unix, which was the kind of the x86 standard Unix that was used at the time. And we need a Windows version, and we need a DOS version. And the Windows and DOS versions had to listen to events from the NetWare server running his code that would then warn users and do all this stuff. So I remember my dad, it was like 1992. I was still in high school. My dad's like, hey, do you want to help me with some stuff? And I was like 15, and I just couldn't believe that he had just asked me to help him. And then he said, oh, and I'll pay you. And like, I mean, it was like and it wasn't a lot of money. It was, it was like $5 an hour US, which was good
Yeah.
money, but it's like I was working like 2 hours a day after school or whatever. But it was like he didn't have to pay me. I would have done it, right? Just the fact that he asked me to help, So I did. I wrote all the Unix code. I wrote. So this was kind of the first step. I wrote the TSR that listened to the events from the network server and would like pop up a modal on the screen telling the user what to do and all this stuff. And it was using the NetWare protocol, which is IPX and SPX, which is loosely related to like UDP and TCP in the kind of the IP world. So one was guaranteed delivery, one was best effort, but it was using those protocols to communicate with the server. And then they also wanted an embedded version that could run on like a single board computer that was like 186 based. It was a microcontroller. It had serial ports, whatever. They created this prototype to set on top of the UPS. And what they put on that one was an SNMP. They wanted SNMP on that because they wanted to have Unix machines as clients, listening to SNMP events. So I had to build a small operating system to load on this thing. And we ended up selling the code to that operating system to a company. They licensed it perpetually to it was C-based operating system. It was like an event handler type thing with some real-time capabilities, real simple. And it wasn't like something that you would interact with. You would link it together with your application, and that's how you deployed it. But it provided all the different services that you would want for an OS. And then came the Windows part. That was a couple of years later. And yeah, it was Windows 95. And of course, my dad was like, I don't want to deal with Unix. And at the time, he's like, I don't want to deal with this either. Why don't you do it? I'm like, sure. So I started working with Visual C++. And I had used, some Microsoft tooling on DOS that was kind of the spiritual predecessor to that. I think it was Visual C and also CodeView, the debugger, the symbolic debugger, which excellent debugger on DOS, right, for a symbolic debugger. It wasn't until I started using GDB much, much later in my career that I started getting, I missed a lot of the functionality of CodeView, like to actually debug programs. But anyway, so Visual C++, and what it had was this thing called MFC, which is Microsoft Foundation classes, which what they did, it wasn't just it would basically write all of the UI code for you, assuming that you followed a very specific pattern. So it was very opinionated. This was my first exposure to an opinionated type of system. And before the Visual C++, I also wrote you could use the Win32 API to write basically shell applications. You didn't have to actually write graphical ones. Yeah. And I wrote one that would basically, do the very rudimentary alerting that we had on the DOS version. But then, I started with Visual C++. I wrote some software for that client. And then we also wrote a C+ version of that operating system I told you about. That was designed, again, to link with your application and then deploy on an embedded target. And this one, what I did with Visual C++ is I wrote effectively what's called a case tool, you would select components which would map to classes that were the OS, that I had built for the OS to do different things, and you would connect them together, and then it would just write the shell code for you, just like Visual C++ did with UI stuff. Yeah. But I remember being like incredibly frustrated because it was too opinionated, and I didn't understand at the time that was the way, right? Like I thought, no, I want it to look like this, and it said, no, if you want to build a UI app that does this and this, it's got to fit this pattern. Yes. And at the time, that didn't connect for me, and I ended up hacking because they provided the code for the MFC, the source code that was part of your license. You could actually change the code if you wanted to, and I would hack the code constantly to make like low-level GDI calls because I didn't like what it was doing in certain levels and whatever. But I did that, and then eventually, until I want to say 1996, I moved on to, and then from there it was all Unix and eventually Linux. I even stopped running desktop Windows around I want to say 1997. So I actually ran desktop Linux, and I had all the struggles with desktop Linux, and I loved it, right? And I did that all the way up until 2011 when I switched to Windows 7. I'll get to that in a minute. But starting in 2001, I started working on Windows virtualization, Linux-based Windows virtualization platforms. And so I was writing, primarily Linux code. Right? Yeah, Win4Lin was the product that we had, and it was so basically it would It would allow you to run a full Windows 95, fully integrated with your Linux desktop. And we then, a couple of years later, made a server version of that. And we had, I am convinced, this is the first actual VDI that's ever been. We didn't call it VDI at the time, but we had a customer in Italy. I remember going to Milan to help them deploy it. And we had built this way through symbolic linking of creating like a copy on write mechanism for running Windows desktops from a single template, Windows 98 desktops from a single template across a multi-user, Linux system. And it's effectively VDI, but for like Windows 98. Then we that was the spiritual predecessor to Virtual Bridges, which we founded in 2006. And later, a few years later, we met. But Virtual Bridges was about the first problem was getting Windows 2000 to work. And I had tried using the same mechanisms we had done before, but it was impossible because it involved like patching code in real time as it was being loaded. And it was just way too complicated. And then Intel VT started coming out, and we were using QEMU at the time and blah, blah, blah. But the point is, I was touching Windows from that side. So I was actually trying to virtualize Windows. I wasn't developing for Windows. I had obviously, written some utilities that ran inside the Windows VM to communicate with the host and things like that. But they were like services. They weren't anything super exotic, and some driver work and things of that nature. And then I spent 13 years with that firm, and a few years later, we started working together there as well. But in 2000, I want to say 11, I remember I bought myself a Sony Vaio, like effectively a netbook, but a very high end one, because I was carrying around like a 7-pound laptop, so like call it a 3-kilogram laptop, right? And I was traveling with this, and I remember having shoulder pain from like having the bag, with this thing was so big. It was 16-inch Dell, it was a really nice machine, but it was just super heavy. So I said, I need something smaller, and light and whatever, and just to be able to use anywhere and something in with good battery life. So at the time, like Sony was making some really interesting hardware, right? And it was like really high end and really cool and all this stuff. So of course I tried to run Linux on it. And that was a disaster because the graphics, when I finally got something working, it was just unusable. It was so slow and whatever. So I said, you know what? I'm going to give Windows like a really honest try here. Because it's been a long time, I know, and I've been virtualizing it. I was running Windows 7 in a VM for different things, this was the software I was building. So I installed Windows 7 and I said, I'm going to give myself 1 month, like to just fight through the pain, right? Because I know like it's going to hurt, it's going to be weird, it's going to whatever. And I did. And within like 2 weeks, I found myself being so productive for like desktop stuff, including like file management and all these different things, that I just decided to stay on the platform permanently. And to your point, Vivek, that was Windows 7. It was an incredibly productive, platform, really, really stable, really robust, both running in VMs and running natively. And I've done the Windows 8, Windows 10, and now Windows 11 kind of evolution through there, and I can talk about that in a minute. But what do you kind of I know you're a big fan of COM and kind of that whole methodology that Microsoft had. What else can you say about the platform, like from a developer perspective, that people might find surprising or interesting?
I think the Windows APIs, I don't know, the Windows API is a well designed API. I found that, it was not hard to start getting a sense of how things are done.
Right.
And then there's a lot of times where you could just kind of intuit that there's going to be a function to do this and it would exist. And the documentation is amazing. Like that Windows.hm file, back in the day they had those CHM files which you open.
Yeah. Or hyper, what was it called? It was Windows help, but it had a term. It was hyper context sensitive help, but I forgot what I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so you just have that one thing and it has a developer guide, it has API reference and everything, and then it's got hyperlinks, and then you can just examples.
Right?
Before that the whole MSDN style documentation came.
Yeah.
The earlier version was you had compiled help meta format, I think it was called.
Mm-hmm.
You had to you could create those also. There were tools to do it.
Yeah, right. You could ship your software with.
And it had this thing where you could merge all the documentation from different applications in the same viewer.
Yeah.
You would have the Delphi documentation, the Windows API documentation, the Windows SDK stuff, and all that together. And the fact that the Windows SDK was given out for free, right? That was like amazing. Like you get everything that you needed to build, they even distributed the command line version of the C plus compiler for free, right? You could do that.
Yeah. Right.
So, and I did a project for one gentleman who I forget his real name, but he was known as a March Hare. He was a Microsoft MVP and he specialized in direct show. So
Okay.
he needed something which would help read MOV files, Apple movie files.
Hmm.
So I built that in direct show for him, and in return he gave me an MSDN subscription because he had a few lying around.
Which, by the way, was not
I
cheap.
mean, like that
Even
was not
here,
cheap. I think it
they
was
were like
worth
over $1,000.
$1,000. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I got this. I got it shipped over from the US. It's a nice case with about 50 CDs of all kinds of software, including
Yeah.
stuff like Windows 2013 server, 2003 server, and stuff like that. I mean, it was amazing. Like I didn't have to look for software anymore. I used those for
Right.
for almost a decade. Like that was amazing. And I think as Microsoft was a developer oriented,
Yes.
they made it really good. They made life easy for the developer. Right?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say, I mean, we think of today, right? Like think of companies that have done that successfully since Microsoft. NVIDIA comes to mind, right? They spend a lot of time, so they have these devices, obviously their GPUs is what they're known for. But what really made that adoption for let's say non-gaming possible, which is kind of where their growth came from, was in kind of high performance computing, right? Not gaming. They were niche in gaming, very good, but niche. But CUDA, right, is what kind of made them what they are today. It was the software that pulled the hardware. It allowed developers to build. They created an ecosystem for developers by distributing these development tools for free. They allowed developers to build all kinds of code that actually use CUDA, and it became the de facto standard for how you actually talk to an accelerator. And Microsoft had pioneered this now the developer tools were not free. They were, in fact, in absolute terms, they were expensive.
Yeah.
Because especially as hardware prices started dropping, the software prices did not drop.
Yeah.
But you got tremendous value from these tools, right? Like tremendous.
I mean, technically, you could just have used the Microsoft SDK, which was for free, with the compiler and the Lua, and built apps from that.
Right.
There was enough to do it.
But if you bought an MSDN's, subscription, even if you used it for 1 year, to your point, you paid for 1 year, you used it for a decade, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how much value you had in these things, and it had everything that you need.
Yeah, everything in there. So Office and everything, and I mean while Windows itself has had a lot of bad rap, you can't disagree that Microsoft Office and Visual Studio, I think for a long time the top used app on Apple was Microsoft Office.
Yeah.
And Windows users would complain that the version of Office on the Mac is much better than the one that you get in Windows. There was actually a difference apparently.
There is a difference. I think it's the other way, that Microsoft, especially Word, works much better on Windows than it does on Mac. But whatever. The point is, Office was a hugely popular suite, and look, from business perspective, it's de facto standard for all business sort of documentation and communication at this point, right? So, yeah.
So it's a kind of been there's been some pain points, and you learn to live with it because the world is full of pain, right?
Yeah.
But and one thing that I've noticed, I think it's not the case right now, but back in the day during the Windows XP to the Windows 7 era, the GUI performance of Windows, right? How snappy it felt. Right? Things just came, it felt very solidly snappy, and Linux desktops didn't reach that till around late 2010s, I felt. It always felt like, the system was doing a little more work to draw stuff on the screen. Right? It didn't feel like a GUI native experience. It felt like the GUI is pasted on.
I think a lot of that has to do with the software architecture, with the amount of layering that happens on Linux to do UIs, where on Microsoft, a lot of the stuff is running very close to the kernel. Right?
Kernel, yeah.
And the
it's
driver.
Only recently, once graphics acceleration came into the picture, that it kind of became uniform. Now you don't see much difference. In fact, now it feels like Linux seems a little more snappier than Windows. I don't know for what reason, but it does. So yeah, it's been a long journey, and so many memories, so many things that I learned about computing came from the Windows side of things.
Yeah. Let me talk about WSL. You brought it up earlier, and I'm not sure people actually realize this, because they talk. So I hear this kind of, let's say, misinformation all the time. I literally hear people say, "Oh, I love my Mac because it's just Linux." It's like, no, your Mac is not Linux. Okay, it's running. Again, I'm not saying anything negative about the Mac by saying this. This is just a fact. It's running a mock microkernel with an OS 10, with their personality and all this stuff. And they're giving you a BSD personality on top of that kernel to actually use, as a shell. And yes, it feels very much like a Unixy, type of environment, and it has a lot of things that are derived from there. I mean, remember that when OS 10 kind of originated, when Steve Jobs came back from Next, that was a Unix, type of play, and they brought a lot of those things over to the Mac. And yes, these are very sort of POSIX type of systems, but it's not Linux. Yeah. WSL is literally Linux. It is the Windows subsystem for Linux. So what they've done, and they've gone through 2 iterations of this. Okay, one is, and I used them both. And by the way, I missed the first one. And I wish they had gotten it right, because I understand why they went to the second one, and it works much better. The first one was very ambitious, and here's what I mean by that. They tried to create effectively a personality on top of Windows that would use the NTF. It would actually use your native Windows file system and everything underneath, and would translate all this and provide you a personality for Linux.
It's kind of like the opposite of Wine, right? It was like API emulator. Yeah.
Yes. But it was a Linux kernel personality on top of Windows. It wasn't a virtualized Linux environment, which is what it is now. But it was really cool, because you didn't have to, for example, have like a virtual disk or anything like that. You just used your Windows file system, but it was slow because those translations are actually really expensive. So then WSL, and the other thing you couldn't do, for instance, is you couldn't run Docker inside of it. You had to install Docker Desktop, and then you had a complicated way to connect the Docker daemon that was running on the kind of in its own VM on the Windows system to your WSL1 system, so you could actually do Docker stuff. But it was a bit disjoint. WSL2, they said, okay, we're going to use Hyper-V, because we have this great hypervisor that you can it's an enterprise-grade hypervisor that's built into the OS. You might as well use it. It's like their version of KVM, but that's a gross oversimplification of what it is, but let's just say. And we're gonna create a really stripped down Hyper-V experience for this purpose. And this purpose is to create a virtual machine that boots a native Linux kernel and a Linux environment, and has a virtual disk, but also has very smooth integration into your Windows file system. So for example, you have a mount point where you have access to your Windows disk, and you still have issues like file permissions are not exactly the same. All these, they're different file systems. You're not going to unify them, but accessibility is really straightforward. And to your point, the integration between the Windows UI and the WSL is very, very good. They solved all those problems. The other thing they did is they made it really easy to install Linux. You just use WSL to install Linux. You just WSL install, and then you tell it Ubuntu, 26 or whatever, and boom, there it is. And then in Windows 11 specifically, because people use their own shells, their own terminal emulators and everything, but the terminal for Windows 11 is actually really good. I'm using it natively now. I run Claude code in my Windows 11 environment, because as you said, we've come full circle. We're back to the command line, right? But but the point is that the terminal emulator is as good as anything I've used on any platform, including a native Unix platform. And this is available for free in your Windows 11. You need the Pro version, whatever comes installed with any computer that you buy. And you actually have a Linux development workstation. Let me put it in these terms. When I was running desktop Linux, okay, which I did for between, I don't know, it was like 15 years or 14 years of exclusive desktop Linux use, I had to have some kind of either virtualization or emulation to use some productivity apps. Well, now I can run those productivity apps natively at native speed, and I can do my Linux development natively at native speed. It's running in a VM, but it's very light.
Better than even a hypervisor, because it's right there on the same desktop.
I mean, it's freaking brilliant, and it's like
effort to get your Linux going. Like I just took my Windows laptop, installed the Arch Linux distro on WSL, copied my home directory onto there, and it's just as good as my.
Just as good. And by the way, if you put your files in a certain place, they get synced to OneDrive. If you put, this stuff all just happens automatically. And to put it in perspective, we did Nimbix together, right? Mm-hmm. I think you joined, I joined, there were 2 guys, I joined, and then I brought you on like 3 to 6 months later. I forgot exactly. I think it was like 5 months later. And I used WSL to develop everything, maybe not at the very beginning. I might have been SSHing into a Linux system to do some things, but just because WSL wasn't available. But as soon as WSL became available, which was not long after that, I built everything on WSL. Everything that I did for Jarvis, for the product that we built, which, I know it's evolved a lot since I've moved on from that, but you're still working with that technology. But at the time, it was just you and me. You built a whole lot of stuff. I built a whole lot of stuff. Everything that I built was on WSL.
Right.
I mean, I can't give it a better, and that was over years and years and years, right? I cannot give it a better, for me, if I want to run Linux, like if I say I need Linux, I'm going to run WSL. I'm not going to consider anything else.
Yeah. I mean, look at the irony of it. The gateway to Linux becomes so much more easier through Windows.
Yeah.
Just imagine the difference between doing a native installation versus just clicking an app and it's Linux in an app, right? What
And
more?
by the way, I can run, not only that, I can run multiple different versions of Linux by just clicking on them.
Yeah.
At the same time, right?
This is like, it's reached the point where, it's actually good for Linux. I mean, how many users would have even touched Linux if they hadn't got WSL, right?
Right. 100%. I mean, it's very good for Linux because it's now, it's again, it used to be like, oh, you were either Windows or Linux. Now it's like, no, it's the same thing.
Yeah, same thing, yeah.
There's actually no difference. And Microsoft and hats off. I mean, again, the level of, think about this journey, right? When 20 years ago, Microsoft committed to killing Linux, right?
Yeah.
And then today they have the friendliest, most straightforward way to deploy and use Linux of any platform in the world.
Yeah.
And they've done that and they continue to improve it, right?
Yeah.
So
I think they've done a lot of work in the Linux kernel itself to improve the virtualization stuff for
it's really fast. It's really fast. I mean, you can tell that especially the later versions, to your point, that are running in the newer kernels, very fast and very simple.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So, closing thoughts.
Well, I mean, I would just say that I'm a practitioner. I honestly don't care what people use on their desktop or their servers or whatever. You use the best tool for the job. For me, like, I don't see myself moving off of the Microsoft platform as a desktop environment. I use it for my personal stuff. I actually use I use a Mac for work, but it's just an internet client, right? Primarily. But for my personal stuff, I still use Windows. I do music production on it. I do all kinds of stuff. But then now with Cloud Code, obviously I'm doing Linux stuff on it as well. And I did that for many years. I don't have a reason to move off of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that Windows 11 is actually, it's pretty good. I used the very early version of it and it was bad. It had issues. This one has one nagging issue that they haven't fixed yet, but I have a very simple workaround for it. It has to do with when you unplug your, I have a laptop, so obviously I plug it into and I don't use a docking station. I use the DisplayPort connector because why would I use a docking station for one cable? When you unplug it and you plug it back in, even though I have it set to show the taskbar on all displays, it hides the taskbar permanently on my laptop display, which I use. My setup is I have the laptop and I have, when you see me looking up like this, and I am at the same work setup, I have a large 43-inch screen on top like this. Okay. So I do the same thing for my personal side. But so I wrote a stupid PowerShell script to restart Explorer, and I just double click it. I put a desktop icon because obviously I'm not going to put it in the taskbar. And you just double click it and it restarts. It kills Explorer.exe and it comes back and there's a taskbar.
We've all done that.
I don't understand why they can't fix that, but who cares? I mean, this is not going to detract me from using a platform that otherwise, compared to the original Windows 11 that I first used at where you are now, was my first experience with it on a company issued laptop. It was a disaster. And some of it had to do with the bloatware that they load on it, the nannyware that the company loads and all that stuff. On your personal one, obviously, you don't load any of that stuff.
The internet search and all that stuff, which kind of
exactly. And the other thing I'll say about Windows as well, that I don't think people realize this, we talked about it. We talked about antivirus and everything. The Windows Defender that I've been running since Windows 7, I don't think...
I don't think
a virus that I've had.
Since Windows 10, no one installs a third-party antivirus.
No. And it's bulletproof, right? I mean, I haven't seen any exploit. Of course, there's zero-day exploits. There's all this stuff that happens out there. But, unless you're doing some shady stuff, if you're just doing normal stuff, like your internet access is normal, you're not trying to go to some very suspect type of sites and things like that, dark web stuff, you're probably fine. And
I think the culture's also changed, right? I mean, it's been a long time since I went and downloaded an exe installer from somewhere and installed it.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, I do for my music software. I use, but Microsoft they've been supporting signed software now for the longest time. So like it warns you if the publisher can't be verified and all that stuff, right? So, anyway, those are my closing thoughts. My closing thoughts are having left the platform as a developer, come back as a developer, but from the Linux side, and then eventually embraced it as the go-to platform for everything. I can say that I really like where Microsoft is today from a Windows perspective, and I can't see myself moving off of that, permanently. So that's mine. What about you?
well, I have two things. One is what I think about Windows, and the other is a small tidbit. So I think it's been annoying in some ways. The different people want different things, but I think overall it's turned out that Windows has converged to a very good platform, right? And they've
Hmm.
left a lot of their baggage and their weird business sense and all that stuff. They move towards what's really good for customers and what's really good for the world, which is great. I mean, they've evolved as a company both technologically as well as socially and ethically, which is
Right.
something we always come back to. But it's good to see Microsoft today, right?
Yeah.
They're doing all these things, and yeah, I'm sure that they still have the profit motive and all that, like all business. But it's, I mean, they're given a lot back, right?
Mhm.
And that kind of does take away from what they took for a lot of years, right? So that's great. And the tidbit I have is one of the most cool applications that I had on Windows 95 or 98 was a 2 byte file, right? A 2 byte com file. It just had int 19 in there, right?
The
What you
bootstrap,
do is
you would
you
reboot.
just set it up to, you had this thing like run this program in MS-DOS mode, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So going to MS-DOS mode from Windows 98 was instantaneous, right? You
Yes.
just open the shell. So when you run int 19 on an MS-DOS mode, it would reboot without the BIOS, the system startup check. So on those
Yep.
old computers, which should take 10 or 15 seconds, you could reboot your Windows really fast. So it was called reboot.com. I think it's the shortest useful program that I ever discovered by playing around with stuff.
Yeah. This is because it was using the FAT file system. Corruption wasn't. There wasn't any like.
Yeah, I mean, like it would, you can reboot, and once you go into MS-DOS mode, it's like Windows is anyway out of the picture. It's just
Yeah. Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Now it's cool.
All right, Vivek. Well, first, thanks to our viewers. It's been fun, kind of this trip down memory lane. But like I said, for me, it's still very much a daily, current day thing. If you want to, if you like the podcast, please subscribe. If you like the episode, please click like. Vivek, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts as usual. I'm
It
sure
was a
it's not the
pleasure.
last. It's not the last time we're going to hear about Com or Delphi. I have a feeling we talk about it every episode. But anyway, thanks again to everyone, and we'll see you
Thanks,
next time.
everyone. See you around. Bye bye.